Welcome back to another episode of the Newt News Podcast. Today, we're doing another one of our 2024 player profiles, and we're talking about Dylan Carlson. And I think if we're talking storylines here between the three of us, there's probably no player on the Cardinals who's at a bigger crossroads in his career than Dylan Carlson. Former top 15 prospect in all of baseball, was maybe the best prospect the Cardinals had since Oscar Taveras, really, at the time. Switch hitting guy who was supposed to be above average to well above average bat with decent power, really good defense. Just one of those guys who wasn't necessarily going to be great at any one thing, but was going to be really good at a lot of things. Came up early in his career, was successful, was top 3 in Rookie of the Year voting. Who's continuing to look more and more like the kind of guy that when he was a prospect, John Mozeliak said you would have to pry from his cold, dead hands in order to get a hold of. He looked like the guy that you wouldn't want to necessarily part with in a Juan Soto trade, not necessarily it wasn't 1-to-1, but they didn't want to necessarily give up the farm to get him. And now, is he even going to be on the team next year? He's a 4th outfielder right now. Maybe he'll get some opportunity because of the Edman injury. Sandy, like, what's the storylines? What are you most looking at with Dylan Carlson coming into? We're in middle of spring training right now, coming into the 2024 season.
Yeah, when I think about Dylan Carlson, I just get really sad. Like you said, he was a super exciting prospect. I've got his prospect page from back in 2020 when he topped out at number 15 pulled up. Like, his tools across the board were really good. They had him at a 60 overall, 60 power, 55
60
hits,
power.
60 power. Carlson's like his calling card as a prospect was his power, and it never showed up at the big league level. It's really sad to think about the fact that they projected him to be a guy that hit 30 home runs someday. Like, nowadays, you hear that with Carlson and you think that's impossible. That would never happen.
Yeah.
He was just such an exciting guy, had so much potential, and it just hasn't worked out. And the Cardinals have had plenty of guys not work out over the years. Every team does. But Carlson is one that just, really is stuck in my craw. So the storylines with him, like you've said, just like disappointment over the last few years. He's at a huge crossroads, and I think this spring he's looked terrible. There's not really a way around it. Not that anyone on the Cardinals offense has looked great. But Carlson's gotten a little bit more playing time than other people. It hasn't been pretty so far. The at-bats just don't look competitive, and it's hard to be excited for him. I see him as a 4th outfielder on this team, and if things go poorly, the Cardinals could unload him the way they offloaded Tyler O'Neill for very little.
It's interesting to look at Carlson too, because the Cardinals and fans will their fans will get kind of ridiculed for being too high on guys at times. But like in the case of a Carlson, he was someone that the entire industry was super high.
Correct.
Even last year in the second half when he was struggling, when you would have national writers or national people come talk about the Cardinals, they would still value Dylan Carlson over a Lars Nootbaar or over a lot of these guys because of they thought the talent was still there. So like when you look at like this isn't a Brendan Donovan Lars Nootbaar situation where they kind of came out of nowhere. Like the whole industry thought he was like not quite Jordan Walker, but a half step below him and was in the same class as a Nolan Gorman.
Better than Nolan Gorman.
Yeah.
Carlson was valued higher than Gorman for years.
Yeah. So Andrew, like what are you thinking about in terms like what's in your mind when you think of Dylan Carlson coming into the season right now?
I just want to see what he'll probably get an opportunity to start in center opening the season up just because I don't think Edman's going to be ready for opening day. Like we haven't had any confirmation of that, but it just doesn't sound like they're ready to start him on opening day. He hasn't even progressed to taking live BP yet. So I think that's going to be the real prove it time for Dylan Carlson, and he's going to have to show that he has something left in the tank for him to have any value. And I feel like regardless of whether or not he does show that, like if he does, then he builds some of his trade value back up. And we kind of don't really need Carlson at this point as a 4th outfielder. Like obviously it's great, but like Edman can play center, Victor Scott can play center, Nootbaar can play center. So we don't really need the center field depth that we used to. Like when Harrison Bader was traded, Carlson was kind of the only guy that could play center field. But I'm really interested to see what happens with him. If he plays well or if he plays poorly, I feel like he's on his way out regardless. And I don't know. It's sad to see some of the at-bats that he's put together this spring. Obviously, the offensive production hasn't been what we've liked. They haven't hit home run yet, which is pretty funny. But I still think Dylan Carlson has been one of the worst offensive players to start this spring, kind of like Kisner or DeYoung last spring, where we're like, oh, maybe this guy who didn't get a lot of chances probably isn't going to get many more chances again.
Yeah, and I think you'll find a a section of Cardinal fans that sometimes think Dylan Carlson's been shafted a little bit, not necessarily given the amount of opportunities he should have. But I think I'm kind of the opinion that I think the start of 2023 was weird for him, where he was kind of cast as the fourth outfielder. They gave not Dylan Carlson, Tyler O'Neill the center field job. But pretty much anytime he's gotten an opportunity, he's gotten hurt or not been good enough ever since that trade deadline, which at that time he looked great. He was kind of coming into his own again, coming off of the third place rookie of the year finish. Andrew, you kind of made a good point. And the Cardinals also have a really tough April. And so if Tommy Edman's not available, like not only is it kind of Dylan Carlson's like do or die situation in center field, but they also kind of need him to be good because this is going to be the toughest stretch of games. They can't afford to get into a hole again. If they get into a hole again, the season kind of goes downhill again. So they need him to be good in defensively in center field. They need something from the 8 spot. They can't have him be a net negative there. So I think it's really interesting time for him because of the fact that for him personally as a player, this means so much to him, but as a team, the opportunity when he's going to get his opportunity, which it looks like he's going to with Edman's injury, is going to be important. So, Sandy, think like best case, worst case scenario for Dylan Carlson in 2024. Like obviously, the best case scenario for any player is to pop off and be like an all-star. But like realistically, what's the best case scenario for him in your brain, and what's worst case in your brain for him? And injuries, okay, like that's always a thing. So like performance-wise, what's worst case scenario?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've kind of cast him as a guy who's at a crossroads. And the best case scenario is that he resurrects his career. That doesn't mean he's going to be an all-star. Like you said, that's just not a likely thing. And if that was going to happen for Carlson, it's years from now. It's not right now. But Carlson's only 25 and he'll be 25 for the entirety of this season. That's still pretty young. And he definitely wouldn't be the first player to figure it out at age 25.
Totally.
We've also seen him perform well in the past. I've got his baseball reference page up right now. In 2021, Carlson was a 780 OPS guy with a 115 OPS plus. He was a really good player. There's a world in which Carlson gets some of that back. He needs to add power again. He probably should stop switch hitting. And I think if Carlson makes the right adjustments this year, plays decent defense in center field, you're looking at a 3-win player if he's actually performing. So that's kind of my best case scenario. Best case scenario for Carlson, he finishes the year firmly a part of the Cardinals' future plans, I would say. The worst case scenario, though, is that the wheels fall off. The regression last year, where, I mean, he only appeared in 76 games, 651 OPS, 79 OPS plus, so over 20% below league average as a hitter. The worst case scenario is that those regressions aren't temporary, they're permanent. And that's who Carlson is as a ball player. He's terrible this year, and the Cardinals unload or offload him at the end of the season.
Andrew, what are you thinking, man?
Yeah, I feel like that's just about sums it up. I feel like there's a really good chance that he doesn't make it towards the end of the season, and we offload him for like a reliever that nobody really values. And maybe, hey, that could work out like the Sosa, Jojo Romero trade, or maybe the Tyler O'Neill trade. We don't know how that's going to go yet. But I'm sure there's some team that's interested in him, just not going to give up what we would have expected like a couple of years ago for a player of this caliber. So I feel like obviously Carlson's much more valued than Sosa. He was a backup shortstop, and like getting somebody like Jojo Romero, would be really disappointing, honestly, for someone that we valued as a top 15 prospect at one point. But I feel like that's kind of where it's come down to. And yeah, you're right. He could resurrect his career, be an all-star candidate, maybe an all-star. I don't know, probably not. But it's just not at this point something that I think is realistic. And honestly, we're probably going to see something in between, like getting borderline DFA'd and then getting like all-star votes, like somewhere in between there is probably where you're going to get. And someone who's like very average platoon bat, I think is the expected outcome, but it could go very poorly or kind of well. I don't know.
Yeah, I'll put in like my best case, worst case. So maybe I'll shrink it even more and say like best case is that he figures out a way to be an elite platoon bat without consistent playing time, because the hope is that Tommy Edman's their consistent center fielder. And then I just am so high on Victor Scott. I know we are, that I would hope at some point he factors into the conversation, but I feel like it's looking more and more like that's later in the year, if not 2025. But I would say like one of the major red flags of Carlson last year is not only was he just continuously terrible against right-handed pitching like he has been most of his career, but he also stopped being elite against left-handed pitching. And so I think he's got to, if he's going to provide value for this club in a realistic sense, he's got to be able to mash left-handed pitching when called upon, even if he's not playing every day. And then worst case, I think it's like he's playable. Like he's not like so bad you move him off the roster, but he's a clear fourth outfielder. Like right now, he could be a really good fourth outfielder where he starts on a lot of clubs, but on the Cardinals, he's the fourth outfielder. I think the worst case is it's like, yeah, like this dude is a backup outfielder. That's what he's got.
Yeah, I just want to say one more thing. I think the best case scenario for Carlson also involves him putting up better rate stats than Tommy Edman offensively. Carlson has a higher ceiling than Edman offensively, and I'll die on that hill. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Carlson's totally capable of being a 110 OPS plus guy, especially if he's facing the right guys, if we're using him correctly. But that's best case scenario. Worst case scenario could be really bad.
I know a lot of people are really high on Carlson's defense in center field, but I just think even in the short sample size, Edman proved he's superior than Dylan Carlson in center field. So I think like there's a world where Carlson's the better player in center field, but it's a step back, not a huge one, but a step back defensively in center field with a better bat, which is probably a more valuable player. But so let's go down. I'll give my prediction first of what we actually think Carlson will be, but first let's look at the Zips predictions because we've been doing that for each player. Zips has Carlson at a 254, 335, 412 slash line with a 105 WRC plus, a 2 WAR player if he were to play about 126 games. We haven't included this for every player, but I think it's interesting. Steamer has him play as more of a part-time player playing in just 94 games, but they have him as a 112 WRC plus guy. So I'm guessing they're more projecting him as a platoon bat at that point and kind of doing what I was talking about best case scenario. So I include that streamer because I think that's my hope for Dylan Carlson, but I think my actual expectation is he's about league average as a bat, a little bit better, maybe like that 115, 120 at most against left-handed pitching. But I mean, there's not a lot of lefties, so that's not super valuable. And then he's below league average against right-handed pitching, plays good defense, and he's more of that guy. He's like, yeah, he could start on most teams, but he's clearly the third best outfielder for a group. He's the fourth best outfielder in the Cardinals, and that he's either used at the deadline to be moved in some kind of trade or by the offseason, he's probably on the out with the depth that the Cardinals have outfield-wise. But I just think I'm already high enough on a lot of Cardinals that I find a hard time trying to convince myself I'm going to be high on Dylan Carlson now. I kind of hope he gets a change of scenery for his sake and that he can get consistent playing time somewhere else. But even at winter warm-up, when he was asked about, someone asked him, basically said like, hey, Ollie Marmol seems to really have confidence in you, even with the lack of consistent playing time. And they were like, how does that make you feel? And he kind of paused and like looked around a little bit. You can kind of tell he was trying to figure out how he's going to answer it. And I can't remember exactly what he said, but it wasn't really like a very excited argument. So you could just tell, I just think this relationship's starting to deteriorate here. And yeah, so I don't have a lot of high hopes for Carlson this year.
Yeah, I would take the under on the Zips projection, especially with the games played. Like that's just too many games to get your fourth outfielder into, especially when your fourth outfielder is kind of like Brendan Donovan, right? Like there's a lot of
Zips usually does project players out a lot more. So you'll see like a AA player projected 120 games because they're just trying to account. But
like I just don't like young players with consistent playing time is kind of key to get them to be successful. So like you always bring in a veteran bat like Carpenter or Brandon Crawford to fill that, like, oh, he's not going to get a lot of playing time, but he'll still be effective off the bench. Like that's usually not someone who's 25 like Dylan Carlson. So I just don't see him doing the, what was it, like 110 WRC plus, like pretty high compared to, he was just not really a good hitter at all last year. So I don't really see him bouncing back that high. I feel like maybe like a 95 WRC plus is probably like the ceiling for someone who's not going to get a lot of playing time. And against lefties, like you said, he wasn't that great last season either. So I feel like around league average is probably where I would expect to see him land.
Yeah, which we didn't say his stats last year at all. He was a 219 average, 318 OBP, 333 slug, 84 WRC plus, 0.2 WAR player in 76 games. So like that's the floor we're working with here. So like when Andrew, you said 95 WRC plus, that's actually a step forward. So I just think listeners should know that if they weren't aware of how bad it went for him last year.
Yeah, he was terrible last year. But I'll say this: all indications are that he's healthy this year, which is good. The wrist injury apparently was a real thing and it sapped his power. And we've seen that with other guys. Wrist injuries do tend to do that. So I'm a little higher on Carlson getting some of that power back. Fangraphs, I think, has the most convincing or compelling projection for me. They've only got him playing 94 games, but still racking up a 1.7 WAR and like a 109, 108 WRC plus. I think he could fall right around there, to be honest. Carlson's going to get into some games. These are the Cardinals. The Cardinals have injuries every single year, and I might not be projecting a Carlson injury, but someone's going to get hurt. And Dylan Carlson is going to have at least a month of consistent playing time at some point, because it's just what happens with the St. Louis Cardinals. And I think if that happens, you're going to see some encouraging signs. I really hope so, at least. And I think it's hard to not bet on Dylan Carlson's talent when other people around the industry still value him. The prospect pedigree is real here, and I think that's something Cardinals fans forget. We also, like, coming off of last season, which was just so disappointing in every way, I think it's caused a lot of people to devalue players on the Cardinals roster to a point that's goes from being realistic to not realistic anymore. So I feel okay about what Dylan Carlson brings to the table. Fangraphs still rates his tools as average to above average. Like, his current report still gives him 55 grade power, 55 in-game power, which, like, that's above average. So I think Carlson will get somewhere near 1.7 to 2.0 WAR. So I'm pretty high on him, I think, this year.
Well, Dylan Carlson's definitely a name to watch this year. He, like we said at the beginning, we're rounded out. He's at a crossroads. This is probably a career-defining year for Carlson, at least
Absolutely.
in a Cardinal uniform. So we'll be keeping our eyes on him. If you want to keep up with more player profiles, we'll continue to have these on the New News podcast throughout spring training, along with our other podcast episodes and fun videos as well. So if you enjoyed this, subscribe to the YouTube channel, like, comment below. Let us know, what did you think about Carlson last year? What do you think his expectations are this year? And we're excited to continue to break down some more Cardinals. So we'll see you guys next time.